In the bitter cold of February 1979, a fortune vanished from the Baltimore shipyards in less than 12 minutes. No alarms sounded. No witnesses stepped forward. No arrests followed. The thieves disappeared into the industrial maze of steel and concrete, taking with them $3.7 million in unmarked bills and leaving behind a crime scene so clean it might as well have been sanitized. For 44 years, the case gathered dust in federal archives, dismissed as another perfect heist that would never see justice. But in 2023, during the demolition of an abandoned dental clinic on the outskirts of the city, workers discovered something extraordinary. A set of dentures, cracked and yellowed with age, embedded with a microscopic serial number that would crack open one of the most methodically executed thefts in American maritime history. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The Baltimore Harbor in 1979 was a sprawling network of commercial docks, freight terminals, and shipping contractors that processed millions of dollars in cargo daily. Among these facilities was Chesapeake Marine Holdings, a mid-sized operation specializing in containerized freight transfers between international vessels and domestic rail lines. The company had built its reputation on reliability, handling sensitive shipments for corporations that demanded discretion and precision. On the morning of February 23rd, that reputation would be shattered in a matter of minutes. At 4:15 a.m., a refrigerated truck marked with the logo of Eastern Seaboard Transport pulled through the main gate of Chesapeake Marine Holdings. The vehicle appeared routine, identical to dozens of others that arrived weekly to collect perishable goods from overseas shipments. The driver presented standard documentation to the night guard, who barely glanced at the paperwork before waving the truck through. It was a cold Thursday morning, and the skeletal crew on duty was focused on completing their shift without incident. What none of them realized was that Eastern Seaboard Transport had ceased operations 6 months earlier. The truck was a carefully constructed replica, complete with forged registration documents and counterfeit company decals. The man behind the wheel was not a delivery driver, but a former dock worker named Vincent Corelli, who had spent 2 years studying the facility's operations before disappearing from his legitimate job the previous autumn. The truck proceeded directly to Warehouse 7, a secure storage facility located at the far end of the terminal complex. Inside the warehouse, stacked in climate-controlled sections, were dozens of sealed containers awaiting processing. Most held standard commercial goods, textiles, electronics, and machinery. But 3 containers, distinguished only by their discrete federal markings, contained something far more valuable. They held bundles of currency being transported under Treasury oversight, part of a classified program designed to move large sums of cash without attracting public attention. Corelli parked the truck beside the loading dock and activated the refrigeration unit, creating the illusion of a legitimate pickup. He then walked calmly to a side entrance he had observed during his months of surveillance. Using a key duplicated from wax impressions he had made while employed at the facility, he entered the warehouse without triggering any security protocols. The night shift supervisor was completing paperwork in an office at the opposite end of the building, unaware that an intruder was methodically selecting targets just 50 yards away. The operation had been planned with surgical precision. Corelli moved directly to the 3 marked containers, bypassing dozens of others that might have contained valuable merchandise. He had memorized their exact locations and understood which ones held the federal shipments. Using a portable cutting torch concealed in a maintenance bag, he opened the first container in under 3 minutes. Inside, secured in waterproof cases, were stacks of unmarked bills organized for discreet transfer. The currency was not part of any official banking transaction. According to later investigations, it represented funds collected through a network of offshore accounts and was being quietly relocated to prevent detection by federal auditors. The exact source remained classified, but the bills were genuine, untraceable, and worth exactly $3.7 million. Corelli loaded the cases into his truck with methodical efficiency, working in complete silence to avoid detection. By 4:31 a.m., the truck was loaded and moving toward the exit gate. The same guard who had waved it in barely looked up as it departed, assuming the driver had completed a routine pickup. The entire operation had taken 16 minutes from entry to exit, and not a single alarm had been triggered. The theft would not be discovered until the following morning, when a federal inspector arrived to verify the shipment's security. The investigation that followed was immediate and intensive. FBI agents descended on the facility within hours, interviewing every employee and contractor who had access to the warehouse. The truck was found abandoned in an industrial district 12 miles away, stripped of its license plates and thoroughly cleaned of fingerprints. The refrigeration unit had been left running, suggesting the thieves understood the importance of maintaining the illusion until the very end. Vincent Corelli's name surfaced early in the investigation. His sudden departure from the company, combined with his detailed knowledge of warehouse operations, made him an obvious suspect. But when agents arrived at his last known address, they found the apartment empty and the lease terminated weeks earlier. His personal belongings were gone, his bank accounts closed, and his vehicle sold to a used car dealer who remembered only that the seller had paid in cash. The federal investigation expanded rapidly, involving multiple agencies and jurisdictions. Agents traced Corelli's background through employment records, military service files, and criminal databases. What they discovered was a man with no significant criminal history but extensive knowledge of maritime operations. He had served briefly in the Navy, worked at various East Coast shipping facilities, and maintained a low profile that made him nearly invisible to law enforcement. Interviews with former colleagues revealed little useful information. Corelli was described as quiet, competent, and unremarkable. He worked his shifts without complaint, avoided workplace politics, and left no impression on most of his coworkers. Several mentioned that he asked questions about warehouse procedures and security protocols, but such curiosity seemed natural for someone learning the job. No one suspected he was gathering intelligence for a future robbery. The search for the missing currency proved equally frustrating. Federal agents monitored banking systems for unusual cash deposits, tracked serial numbers through financial networks, and coordinated with international authorities to identify potential money laundering operations. Despite these efforts, not a single bill from the stolen shipment ever surfaced in legitimate channels. The money had vanished as completely as the man who took it. As months passed without progress, the case began to lose priority within federal law enforcement. Other crimes demanded attention, resources were redirected, and the Baltimore Shipyard heist became another unsolved file in the archives. The facility implemented enhanced security measures, federal agencies revised their transportation protocols, and Chesapeake Marine Holdings rebuilt its reputation through careful management and increased oversight. But the questions remained. How had one man executed such a precise operation? Had he worked alone, or were there accomplices who remained hidden? Where had the money gone, and how had it been converted into untraceable assets? Most importantly, where was Vincent Corelli, and what had become of him in the years since the theft? The answers to these questions would remain buried for over 4 decades, hidden beneath layers of false identities, fabricated documents, and carefully constructed deceptions. The man who had walked away with $3.7 million had not simply vanished. He had transformed himself completely, adopting a new life built on the foundation of his stolen fortune. And he had done so with such skill that even his death would not immediately reveal his true identity. The transformation of Vincent Corelli from dock worker to ghost began within hours of the heist. While federal agents combed through his abandoned apartment and traced his employment history, the man himself was already 3 states away, sitting in a nondescript motel room in western Pennsylvania. The suitcase beside his bed contained not the stolen currency, but something far more valuable in the long term: false identification documents meticulously crafted over months of preparation that would allow him to disappear completely from his former life. Corelli had understood from the beginning that stealing the money was only half the challenge. The other half was remaining invisible long enough to enjoy it. Unlike amateur criminals who might celebrate their success or make immediate purchases that would attract attention, he had planned his vanishing act with the same precision he had applied to the robbery itself. Every detail had been considered, every contingency anticipated. The documents he carried bore the name Robert Mitchell, complete with a fabricated employment history, manufactured references, and a carefully constructed background that would withstand casual scrutiny. The identity had been purchased through criminal contacts he had cultivated during his years working the docks, men who specialized in creating new lives for those willing to pay premium prices. The investment had cost him nearly $50,000, but it was a small price for complete invisibility. From Pennsylvania, Mitchell traveled west, avoiding major highways and paying for everything in cash. He had divided the stolen money into smaller bundles, concealing them in various locations throughout his vehicle and personal belongings. The bills were unmarked and untraceable, but he knew that spending large amounts too quickly would eventually draw unwanted attention. His plan required patience, discipline, and the ability to live modestly while his fortune remained hidden. 3 weeks after the Baltimore heist, Robert Mitchell appeared in a small industrial town in Ohio, where he rented a modest apartment and began looking for legitimate employment. To neighbors and potential employers, he was a middle-aged man seeking a fresh start after a difficult divorce. He spoke little about his past, claimed to have lost most of his belongings in the settlement, and presented himself as someone eager to rebuild his life through honest work. The performance was flawless because it was grounded in truth. Corelli had genuinely worked in shipping and maritime operations for years. His knowledge was authentic, his skills were real, and his work ethic was unquestionable. When he applied for a position at a local manufacturing plant, his supervisors found him competent, reliable, and refreshingly free of the personal drama that often plagued their workforce. What they could not have known was that their new employee was systematically laundering nearly $4 million through a network of carefully planned transactions. Mitchell had established relationships with small business owners, independent contractors, and cash-heavy operations that could absorb significant amounts of currency without triggering federal reporting requirements. He purchased used cars from private sellers, bought and sold scrap metal, and invested in real estate through intermediaries who asked few questions. The process was slow and methodical. Mitchell understood that patience was his greatest asset and greed his most dangerous enemy. Rather than attempting to convert his entire fortune quickly, he focused on establishing his new identity so thoroughly that even intensive investigation would find nothing suspicious. He paid taxes on his legitimate income, maintained a clean credit history, and avoided any behavior that might attract attention from law enforcement. Years passed without incident. The FBI investigation into the Baltimore heist gradually lost momentum as other cases demanded attention and leads grew cold. Corelli's name appeared on wanted lists and in federal databases, but Robert Mitchell lived quietly in Ohio, working steady jobs, paying his bills, and slowly integrating his stolen fortune into legitimate investments. He had become exactly what he had intended to be: invisible. By the mid-1980s, Mitchell had accumulated enough documented income and established sufficient credit history to make larger financial moves. He purchased a small house in a working-class neighborhood, bought a reliable used car through conventional financing, and opened savings accounts at local banks. To anyone examining his finances, he appeared to be a factory worker who lived within his means and saved responsibly. The reality was far different. Behind the facade of modest living, Mitchell was operating a sophisticated money laundering scheme that converted his stolen cash into legitimate assets. He had invested in precious metals, purchased collectibles through private sales, and acquired rental properties using shell companies and third-party transactions. The original $3.7 million had grown substantially through careful investment and reinvestment. His success bred confidence, but it also created new challenges. As his wealth increased, so did the complexity of concealing it. Mitchell began working with financial advisors who specialized in discreet wealth management, accountants who understood the value of client confidentiality, and lawyers who asked no questions about the source of their fees. He was building an empire, but it was an empire that existed only in shadows. The transformation from Vincent Corelli to Robert Mitchell was so complete that even Mitchell himself sometimes forgot his original identity. He had created not just new documents but a new personality, complete with manufactured memories, fabricated relationships, and carefully constructed preferences. He dated occasionally, maintained casual friendships, and participated in community activities, always careful to remain unremarkable and forgettable. But success brought its own dangers. The more established Mitchell became, the more difficult it was to maintain the precise discipline that had kept him safe. Small compromises led to larger ones, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, he began to take risks that his younger self would have recognized as potentially fatal. The man who had executed a perfect crime was slowly becoming vulnerable to the very attention he had spent decades avoiding. The first crack in his carefully constructed facade appeared in 1987, when a routine audit of his employer's payroll records revealed minor discrepancies in his employment verification. The inconsistencies were small, easily explained, and ultimately dismissed as clerical errors. But they had been noticed, documented, and filed away in records that would someday be reviewed by investigators with more sophisticated tools and greater motivation. Mitchell's response to the audit scare was swift and decisive. Within 6 months, he had relocated to a different state, assumed a slightly modified identity, and begun the process of establishing himself once again. This time, he chose North Carolina, drawn by the state's growing industrial base and the anonymity offered by its expanding suburban communities. The move cost him nearly $200,000 in abandoned assets and relocation expenses, but he considered it a necessary investment in his continued freedom. In Charlotte, he became Robert M. Mitchell, adding the middle initial to distinguish his new documents from any previous records. The addition was subtle but significant, creating enough separation to confuse automated database searches while maintaining the familiarity of his established identity. He found work at a textile manufacturing facility, rented a small apartment in a complex filled with transient workers, and began the careful process of rebuilding his financial network. The late 1980s proved to be an ideal time for Mitchell's reinvention. The economy was booming, cash transactions were still common in many industries, and digital record-keeping was primitive by later standards. He could establish bank accounts with minimal documentation, purchase real estate through simple transactions, and invest in businesses without triggering the sophisticated monitoring systems that would emerge in subsequent decades. Mitchell's strategy evolved as he gained experience. Rather than maintaining one large cache of hidden wealth, he diversified his assets across multiple states and investment vehicles. He purchased small rental properties in different cities, bought and sold classic cars through private collectors, and invested in precious metals through dealers who valued discretion over documentation. Each transaction was modest enough to avoid attention, but collectively they represented a growing fortune. The psychological toll of maintaining his deception was significant but manageable. Mitchell had trained himself to think and act as his fabricated identity, but the constant vigilance required to maintain the performance was exhausting. He could never completely relax, never fully trust anyone, and never allow himself to form the deep personal connections that might expose his secrets. He was wealthy but isolated, successful but perpetually anxious. By 1992, Mitchell had established himself as a respected member of his community. He owned his home outright, drove a well-maintained but unremarkable car, and maintained steady employment at a furniture manufacturing plant. To neighbors and co-workers, he was a reliable, if somewhat private man who kept to himself, but was always willing to help when asked. He attended local sporting events, contributed to community fundraisers, and even dated occasionally, though never seriously enough to risk exposure. The dating relationships were particularly challenging for Mitchell. He was naturally drawn to forming deeper connections, but the risk of discovery made intimacy impossible. He developed a reputation as a kind but emotionally unavailable man, someone who was pleasant company but ultimately unknowable. Several relationships ended when women grew frustrated with his reluctance to share details about his past or discuss future plans that might require background verification. His financial activities during this period were increasingly sophisticated. Mitchell had learned to use legitimate business structures to launder his remaining stolen funds, creating small companies that existed primarily on paper but generated enough documented activity to justify significant cash flows. He owned a vending machine business that operated in rural areas, a small construction company that specialized in cash-only jobs, and a consulting firm that provided services to clients who preferred to avoid detailed record-keeping. The businesses were more than covers for money laundering. They were genuine enterprises that generated legitimate profits. Mitchell discovered he had a talent for identifying underserved markets and creating simple solutions that filled specific needs. His vending machine routes served small factories and warehouses that were too remote for major companies to bother with. His construction projects focused on minor repairs and improvements that homeowners preferred to handle informally. His consulting work helped small businesses navigate regulatory requirements without attracting unwanted government attention. These legitimate successes created an unexpected problem for Mitchell. The more successful his businesses became, the more visible he became within his community. Local newspapers occasionally mentioned his companies in business roundups. Trade associations invited him to join their organizations. Government agencies sent routine correspondence about licensing and tax obligations. Each interaction created records, established connections, and built a paper trail that could someday be traced back to its origins. The mid-1990s brought new challenges as law enforcement agencies began adopting more sophisticated investigative techniques. Computer databases were becoming more comprehensive and interconnected. Financial institutions were implementing stricter reporting requirements. Background check procedures were becoming more thorough and far-reaching. The world that had allowed Mitchell to disappear was slowly being replaced by one where anonymity was increasingly difficult to maintain. Mitchell adapted by becoming even more careful about his activities and associations. He avoided situations that might require extensive background verification, declined opportunities that would bring unwanted attention, and gradually reduced his public profile while maintaining his legitimate business operations. He understood that his safety depended on remaining unremarkable, even as his wealth continued to grow. The approaching millennium created new anxieties for Mitchell. Y2K preparations led to extensive database conversions and system upgrades that could potentially expose inconsistencies in his fabricated background. Financial institutions were implementing new security measures and conducting comprehensive reviews of their customer records. Government agencies were modernizing their record-keeping systems and cross-referencing previously isolated databases. Mitchell spent months preparing for potential exposure, creating contingency plans for rapid relocation, and establishing emergency funds in multiple locations. He reduced his business activities to minimize his digital footprint and avoided any transactions that might trigger automated reviews. The preparations proved unnecessary, as Y2K passed without incident, but the experience reinforced his understanding that technological advancement posed an existential threat to his continued anonymity. The early 2000s brought both opportunities and dangers. The economy was strong, investment opportunities were abundant, and Mitchell's wealth had grown to levels he had never imagined possible. But the same period saw dramatic improvements in law enforcement capabilities, including enhanced database searching, improved forensic techniques, and increased interagency cooperation. The perfect crime he had committed decades earlier was becoming increasingly vulnerable to modern investigative methods. Mitchell's response was to gradually reduce his exposure by converting liquid assets into forms that were harder to trace and monitor. He invested heavily in art, collectibles, and precious metals that could be stored privately and transferred without extensive documentation. He purchased remote real estate that could serve as safe houses if rapid relocation became necessary. He established relationships with lawyers and financial advisors who specialized in protecting client privacy and could provide assistance during emergencies. The transformation was successful, but incomplete. Despite his precautions, Mitchell understood that complete invisibility was no longer possible in an interconnected world. Digital records were permanent, surveillance was ubiquitous, and investigative techniques were becoming more sophisticated each year. He had successfully evaded capture for over 2 decades, but the margin for error was shrinking steadily. In 2003, a routine traffic stop in Virginia nearly exposed Mitchell's true identity. A state trooper ran his license through multiple databases as part of a broader investigation into interstate drug trafficking. The search revealed minor inconsistencies in his employment history that triggered additional scrutiny. Mitchell was questioned for over an hour before being released, but the incident created records that would remain in law enforcement databases indefinitely. The close call prompted Mitchell to make his most dramatic change since leaving Baltimore. He sold his North Carolina properties, liquidated his business interests, and relocated once again, this time to a small town in Tennessee, where he could maintain a lower profile while remaining close enough to major cities to conduct necessary business. The move cost him nearly $500,000 and required him to abandon relationships and investments he had spent years developing. In Tennessee, Mitchell adopted an even more conservative approach to his finances and activities. He purchased a modest home with cash, established minimal business operations, and focused primarily on preserving rather than growing his wealth. He understood that his greatest enemy was no longer poverty or capture, but the passage of time and the inevitable advancement of technology that would make his deception increasingly difficult to maintain. The man who had once been Vincent Corelli was approaching his 70s, and the strain of maintaining his elaborate deception was becoming more difficult with each passing year. His health was declining, his energy was diminishing, and his ability to adapt to new threats was compromised by age and fatigue. The perfect crime was slowly becoming an imperfect prison, trapping him in an identity he could never abandon, but could no longer easily maintain. What Mitchell could not have anticipated was that his downfall would come not from sophisticated law enforcement techniques or technological advancement, but from a simple medical procedure and a microscopic detail that would connect him to a crime committed nearly half a century earlier. The decline of Robert Mitchell began with something as mundane as a toothache in the winter of 2018. At 73, the man who had once executed one of the most precise heists in maritime history found himself sitting in a small dental office in rural Tennessee, waiting for a routine procedure that would inadvertently seal his fate. The tooth that had been bothering him for weeks required extraction, and his dentist recommended a partial denture to maintain his ability to eat properly. Dr. Sarah Chen operated a modest practice that served the working-class community where Mitchell had quietly lived for over a decade. Her office was unremarkable, tucked between a hardware store and a tax preparation service in a strip mall that had seen better days. She specialized in practical dental care for patients who paid in cash and asked few questions about payment plans or insurance verification. For Mitchell, it was exactly the kind of anonymous medical care he preferred. The denture fitting process required multiple visits over several months. Dr. Chen took impressions, made adjustments, and ensured the prosthetic fit properly before delivering the final product. What Mitchell didn't realize was that Dr. Chen had recently begun using a new identification system for her dental work. Each denture she created was embedded with a microscopic serial number, etched into the acrylic using a laser engraving system she had purchased to prevent insurance fraud and patient mix-ups. The serial number was invisible to the naked eye, requiring specialized equipment to detect and read. Dr. Chen had adopted the practice after attending a continuing education seminar where forensic dentists explained how such markings could help identify patients in cases of accidents or disasters. She applied the technique to all her work, creating a detailed database that linked each serial number to specific patient records. Mitchell received his dentures in March 2019 and wore them daily without incident. The fit was comfortable, the appearance natural, and the function satisfactory. He had no reason to suspect that his mouth now contained a permanent link to his fabricated identity, a microscopic breadcrumb that would eventually lead investigators back through decades of careful deception. The final years of Mitchell's life were marked by increasing isolation and declining health. He had developed diabetes, suffered from chronic back pain, and experienced the depression that often accompanies advanced age and social disconnection. The man, who had once been capable of planning and executing a multi-million-dollar heist, now struggled with basic daily activities and found it increasingly difficult to maintain the vigilance that had kept him safe for so long. His financial situation remained secure despite his declining capabilities. The investments he had made over the decades had grown substantially, providing him with more wealth than he could possibly spend in his remaining years. But the money brought little satisfaction. He had no family to share it with, no friends who truly knew him, and no legacy beyond the elaborate lie he had spent 40 years constructing and maintaining. Mitchell's death came suddenly in September 2022. He suffered a massive heart attack while working in his garden, collapsing among the tomato plants he had been tending with characteristic precision. A neighbor found his body the following morning and called emergency services, but resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. The coroner determined that he had died instantly, sparing him the prolonged suffering that often accompanies cardiac events in elderly patients. The aftermath of Mitchell's death was as carefully orchestrated as his life had been. His will, prepared by a lawyer who specialized in discreet estate planning, left specific instructions for the disposal of his assets and personal belongings. Most of his wealth was directed to charitable organizations that focused on maritime safety and worker protection, causes that reflected his original identity as Vincent Corelli, even as they honored his fabricated persona as Robert Mitchell. The house was sold to a development company that planned to demolish it and build a small subdivision. His personal belongings were donated to local charities, or disposed of according to his detailed instructions. His business interests were liquidated, and the proceeds distributed as specified in his will. Within 6 months of his death, virtually every trace of Robert Mitchell's existence had been systematically eliminated. What survived was his medical records, including the detailed documentation maintained by Dr. Chen regarding his dental work. The records included photographs, X-rays, and, most importantly, the serial number database that linked his dentures to his patient file. When Dr. Chen retired in early 2023 and began preparing to close her practice, she donated her patient records to the State Dental Association's Historical Archive, a repository designed to preserve important medical documentation for future research and identification purposes. The demolition of Dr. Chen's former office building began in late 2023 as part of a broader redevelopment project aimed at revitalizing the struggling commercial district. Workers clearing the debris discovered numerous items that had been overlooked during the initial cleanup, including medical equipment, furniture, and personal belongings that had been abandoned in storage areas and forgotten spaces. Among these discoveries were Mitchell's dentures, found in a small container in what had once been Dr. Chen's laboratory. The container was labeled with his patient number but had been mislaid during the office closure and somehow remained in the building when the space was vacated. The construction workers initially dismissed the find as medical waste, but protocol required them to contact local authorities before disposing of any potentially hazardous materials. Detective Maria Santos of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation was assigned to process the various items recovered from the demolition site. As part of her routine documentation, she photographed each item and attempted to identify any materials that might have investigative value. The dentures appeared unremarkable until she examined them under magnification and noticed the microscopic serial number etched into the acrylic. Santos contacted the State Dental Association to inquire about the numbering system and was eventually connected with Dr. Chen, who had moved to Florida but maintained detailed records of her identification procedures. Chen provided the database linking the serial number to patient Robert M. Mitchell, along with photographs and medical history dating back to 2018. The information seemed routine until Santos ran Mitchell's name through federal law enforcement databases as part of her standard verification process. The search results were startling. While Robert M. Mitchell had no criminal record, his personal information contained subtle inconsistencies that triggered automated alerts within the FBI's identity verification system. His Social Security number had been issued during a period when he would have been too young to apply independently. His employment history contained gaps that didn't align with his stated background. His financial records showed cash transactions and investment patterns that were unusual for someone with his documented income level. These discrepancies alone might not have warranted extensive investigation, but they occurred during a period when federal agencies were conducting comprehensive reviews of cold cases using advanced database searching techniques. The FBI had recently launched an initiative to re-examine unsolved crimes from the 1970s and 1980s, using modern technology to identify patterns and connections that had been invisible to investigators using earlier methods. Agent Jennifer Walsh was assigned to investigate the Mitchell anomalies as part of this broader cold case review. Her initial research confirmed that Robert M. Mitchell's identity showed signs of sophisticated fabrication, suggesting possible involvement in federal crimes that predated modern identity verification systems. She requested additional resources to conduct a comprehensive background investigation, including forensic analysis of Mitchell's financial records and employment history. The investigation revealed the elaborate nature of Mitchell's deception. Bank records showed cash deposits and investment patterns that were inconsistent with his documented income sources. Real estate transactions revealed property purchases that exceeded his apparent financial capabilities. Business records indicated involvement in enterprises that generated substantial, undocumented revenue streams. Most significantly, forensic accountants traced Mitchell's financial activities back to their origins in the early 1980s, revealing a pattern of money laundering and asset conversion that suggested access to a large amount of undocumented cash. The timing and methodology were consistent with someone attempting to legitimize proceeds from a major criminal enterprise. The breakthrough came when investigators compared Mitchell's background with records from the 1979 Baltimore Shipyard heist. The geographic proximity of his early activities to the crime scene, combined with his maritime industry experience and the timeline of his financial activities, created a compelling circumstantial case. When agents obtained DNA samples from personal items in Mitchell's estate and compared them with evidence collected from the original crime scene, they confirmed what they had begun to suspect. Robert M. Mitchell was Vincent Corelli, the dock worker who had vanished after stealing $3.7 million from Chesapeake Marine Holdings 44 years earlier. The dentures found in the demolished dental office had provided the microscopic link that connected a dead man in Tennessee to one of the most perfectly executed heists in American criminal history. The FBI's final report concluded that Corelli had successfully evaded capture for over 4 decades through meticulous planning, careful execution, and extraordinary discipline. He had transformed stolen money into legitimate wealth, created a completely fabricated identity, and lived comfortably while maintaining the deception until his natural death. The case was officially closed, not through arrest and prosecution, but through positive identification and comprehensive documentation of the criminal enterprise. The $3.7 million originally stolen from the Baltimore Shipyard had grown to over $40 million through careful investment and reinvestment. Most of these assets were ultimately donated to charity as specified in Mitchell's will, creating an ironic legacy in which stolen federal funds were transformed into resources for maritime safety and worker protection programs. The case became a landmark study within federal law enforcement, demonstrating both the limitations of historical investigative techniques and the power of modern technology to solve seemingly impossible crimes. It highlighted the importance of microscopic evidence, the value of comprehensive database searching, and the reality that even perfect crimes leave traces that can eventually be discovered and analyzed. For the families of the federal agents who had worked the original case, many of whom had passed away without seeing resolution, the identification of Vincent Corelli provided a form of closure that had seemed impossible to achieve. The man who had executed one of the most audacious thefts in maritime history had finally been identified, not through brilliant detective work or sophisticated surveillance, but through a routine dental procedure and a microscopic serial number that survived long after its creator had vanished into the shadows of American criminal history.